All right, welcome everyone to DebSoc's second session on Intro to Asian Parliamentary. Rohan here will be your expert today, taking the session. So yeah, let's begin.
Hey everyone, welcome to the session. Course objectives will be pretty obvious. We're just learning Intro to Asian Parliamentary debate. I want to cover 6 broad ideas within the scope of this one session, which will be approximately 1 hour plus doubts. First thing, what is parliamentary debate and why do we do parliamentary debate? Number 2, Asian Parliamentary in particular and how it goes, what the format looks like and what you're expected to do once you enter a competition which has Asian Parliamentary debate. Number 3, in speaker roles, because you will be in teams of 3. So what does every speaker, the first speaker, what particular job do they have in a debate? What does the second speaker do? What does the third speaker do? So on and so forth. Then I'll quickly go on to burdens and types of motions. This will be covered much more in detail in the next session, which will be intro to argumentation. But I will go through a general idea of what kind of motions you expect. If you don't know what motion is the topic that you're going to go ahead and debate about, which means, for example, if I was to say this house, let's actually show you ranges of motions, right? So wait, I'm okay, my screen sharing is paused. Just give me a second, I'll share my entire screen. So the reason I want to do this first is I want to show you like the breadth of debating, because thousands of people around the world do this, right? It's India, it's other countries as well. And like I also debate on international scale. This is not it. Hello motions. So yeah, and so a lot of people do this, right? So and therefore it's significantly massive as an international hobby, but also pretty interesting with a really active community, right? So it's always nice. So this is a website known as Hello Motions, for example. What Hello Motions is stores all the motions that have been used in competition. So this is a database with like thousands and thousands of motions, but I'll give you an example. So these are the WDC motions. So WDC, if you don't know, is the World's Universities Debating Championships. And this is the biggest competition in the world. Unfortunately, this is done in a different format, which is known as the British parliamentary format, which I'm sure will be introduced to you later. But for now, all you need to know is this is also a type of parliamentary debate. So within that, there were a lot of motions. I don't know why they haven't posted them yet. I will just take you to the tab. So like I talked about, WTC is the biggest competition in the world, happens every year. So this year, for example, Zagreb A won it, where Zagreb, the Croatians. So I'm the Croatian team or team from Zagreb University won it. It was super interesting. Like the finals are really cool. You can see all of that. I was lucky enough to be part of Octo Finals. I was judging the Octo Finals, which is like which puts me around top 75 debaters, like judges in the world, I'm guessing, for that particular year. So I was lucky enough to do pretty well in this competition, and it's super interesting because you see motions of such great breadth. Thank you. So yeah, one important thing to know. One important thing to note about doubts, you can unmute and ask me at any time. I also have the chat open, so if you want to go ahead and see the chat, that's great. This will also be posted tomorrow. Unfortunately, for everyone viewing this tomorrow, I'm not available right now. And you can always personally message me for doubts. My name is Rohan Grover. You can find me on Facebook. But even if not that, Abhijit and everyone will be here to solve doubts. So they're also incredibly reliable with this. So this is a motion, right? Like, for example, I'll tell you this one. This house would ban social media companies from independently deplatforming politicians. So obviously they'll feel like a lot of tricky words here, right? And it's okay if you're confused. A lot of people are. Also notice this is like the biggest competition in the world, so it's slightly more complicated. You don't have to be at this level yet. But I'll give you an example. I'll use this as an example, right? Deplatforming, especially in terms of social media, is when social media goes ahead and removes someone from the platform. So if you've recently read the news, you know that Donald Trump does not exist on Twitter, right? I can show it to you right now. Donald Trump Twitter. See, so Donald J. Trump Twitter, and see, okay, this is one 2016. But if you see, all of his tweets have been taken down. The person is not allowed to go ahead and actually post to Twitter anymore. So this person was deplatformed when they were actively banned from this website by saying, listen, you cannot have a social media presence over here. This debate is whether independent social media companies can go ahead and deplatform politicians. Therefore, is it allowed for you to go ahead and just, or should we ban the idea that social media companies just remove any politician from their own company, like from their own platform? So if you were affirmative is the team that goes ahead and tries to argue for the motion or supports this motion. So which means you're supporting the idea we should ban them. You should, like, you can run an argument, for example, about how people like Donald Trump have said incredibly hurtful and racist things on Twitter, which actively harm minorities or harm other individuals by propaganda, or how they lied about the elections in terms of how it is becoming a fraud, even though multiple trusted sources said that it wasn't being, and there was no proof that the election was the election was undergoing fraud. Trump constantly kept talking about it, that this election is a fraud. At that point, the point at which they're spreading misinformation, at the point this is actively harming citizens, you see results of this. For example, in the Capitol being stormed, the Capitol building went ahead and was attacked, right, in the US. And it's fine if you don't know all of this. Just like, I'm just giving you general real world context over here. And that point, A, you have destruction to property, but B, you also have damage to life, because security guards were continuously being attacked and government security and buildings were continuously being attacked, right? Which means this person's single misinformation tweet can go ahead and cause so much damage. Therefore, it is important that companies can independently ban this politician because they're serving so much harm to the community. So that is what you would say if you want to go ahead and ban. Another argument you can give is if you own the social media. For example, if Mark Zuckerberg goes ahead and is the CEO/owner of Facebook, he can go ahead and do whatever he wants with his own product. You can't go ahead and tell Facebook, hey, you're allowed to keep one individual and you're not allowed to keep another individual. The point at which they're a private company, they can create their own terms of service, and their own terms of service can go ahead and dictate how a person should be treated. Should they be kicked out of the platform? Should they not be kicked out of the platform? And therefore, government cannot go ahead and ban certain things because it is the right of the social media company to choose who it gets to keep in this platform. Opposition is the side that goes ahead and disagrees with the motion. So on the opposite side to the affirmative team, will try to argue, no, this is not the case. Because if you're looking at the deplatforming of politicians are very important because they spread information and they spread important things that people need to know, and social media is the important part. So this debate is not only about people like Trump, it is about other politicians as well, who are important for other people because that's how they get the knowledge of the political system or who to vote for. The point at which you go ahead and this, it's likely that you deplatform these politicians as well for whatever reason, and then you will put more argumentation into that, but I'm not going there. But if you go ahead and deplatform these other politicians, it's going to be harmful because now people don't have access to politics, or like they won't have that much political information, which makes voting bad, which means the next time you go ahead and vote for someone, you don't really know what you're doing, number one, or number two, the wrong person gets elected. Therefore, it's incredibly important for you politicians to go ahead and have social media and access to social media, because their social like like social clout, let's say, or like because they're so popular and because so many people listen to them, it is important for them to spread that information because it actively helps individuals. So that is an argument you go ahead and then make from opposition about how social media should not be allowed to take away politicians because of how important they are to political systems and how political systems are incredibly important to people. So this is a very broad range of an idea I'm giving you on how this works in terms of a parliamentary debate, in terms of how the number one, there is a motion where you're going ahead and a particular topic is given to you. there is a side affirmative, or the side affirmative is also known as side government. For example, side government goes ahead and argues for the motion and tells you why following the thing set in the motion is a good idea. And there's a side opposition, which tells why following the thing in the particular motion is a particularly bad idea for you. So that's how parliamentary debate works. Two things here. Number one, actually three things. Number one, if this is too hard, again, take a deep breath. It's absolutely fine. I don't expect you to understand everything. I'm just giving you an general overview of how debating as an activity on the higher echelons of competitiveness works. You'll not be expected to go ahead and like run into a competition the first thing you do. If you want to, obviously you're very welcome, and I will obviously be there to support you and help you. But even if you don't understand all of this right now, that's absolutely fine. Number two, please make notes, because this, again, I'm going to be dispelling a lot of information in a very brief period of time, simply because there's so much new things, and obviously introducing you to a brand new activity is never going to be easy. And number three, are there any questions right now? Yeah, okay. So coming to your question, Srija, this is a format known as British Parliamentary. In British Parliamentary, there are not two teams, which is what Asian Parliamentary and what I will be teaching you today. There are four teams. So there is opening government, closing government, which means government will have two sides, and opening opposition and closing opposition. So opposition bench will also have two teams. So a total of four teams will debate. Within that, the team that ranks first at the end of the debate gets 3 points. The team that ranks second gets 2 points. The team that ranks third in the debate gets 1 point, and the team that ranks fourth gets 0 points. So the average, so what this means is, for example, OG or opening government team had 17, or like in 17 debates, they took first. In 24 debates, they took second. In 33 debates, they took third. And in 19 debates, they took fourth. And on an average, they scored 1.4 points. So like I said, there are 3 to 1, right? So on average, opening government teams scored 1.42 points. These are not really important for you, but usually what this particular page tells you is how balanced your motion is. So for example, any motion you give, it can be that incredibly easy for government to run, but incredibly hard for opposition to run. Or within British parliamentary, there's something called opening and closing. So closing comes after opening finishes. So they have to give brand new argumentation that is not the same as opening. So at that point, are there enough number of argumentations that teams can make that closing goes ahead and has relatively enough material? If you have a motion in which only opening will use up all the points and it's not deep enough that closing can come up with new ideas, then it's called a relatively shallow motion, and therefore closing will score averagely lower points per half. So therefore, this is a lot of more statistics in terms of how motions work. You absolutely do not need to worry about this. Even I still barely worry about this. So don't worry too much about it at your own level. But that's what this stands for. Are there any other questions? Cool, assuming none. You can always reach out to me personally and like, or like just unmute and ask at any point. Let's go back. Yeah. So one final thing, please do make notes. Like I said, I dispel a lot of information, and therefore it might become, you may forget this in the future. I'm also going to be quickly typing up notes with you, but mine will be obviously be more shorthand. If you need longer notes, go ahead and use that. Otherwise, I will be sharing this particular document so you have like a quick breather, and we have this session recorded as well. So therefore, what is a top parliamentary debate? Two things then. Number one, teams argue for or against a particular topic. We've already talked about how this topic is often referred to in the debate world as a motion. So you will either be assigned affirmative or government, which argues for the topic, or you will be assigned opposition, which argues against the topic, and you will have to compete with the other team. That is how a parliamentary debate works, number one. Number two, you will be having broadly two types of argumentation. If when we go to advanced argumentation, you'll understand there are multiple other things, but for now you need to focus on two argumentation. Number one is constructive argumentation. Constructive argumentation means that you support your own case. So for example, when I was talking about banning the deplatforming of social media, as government, you will go ahead and tell me why banning things is a good thing and why we need to ban this thing in particular. That is a constructive argument where you are building up your own case by providing supporting argumentation. There's also something called rebuttal, and rebuttal is the direct opposite, where you will try to take down the case, the constructive case built by the other team. So you will build a constructive case, opposition also builds a constructive case. That is not enough in a debate. In a debate, you also have to prove why the other team is wrong, not just why you're right, but why the other team is wrong. And therefore, you going ahead and focusing on proving that the other team wrong is rebuttal. So if they make bad arguments, for example, you will go ahead and show why exactly they're bad arguments or why those arguments might possibly be untrue. That is called rebuttal, where you take down other argumentation. Different speakers have different roles, where some will focus more on rebuttal, while some will focus more on constructives. I'll come to all of this later, right? But there are these two things. Though the final question becomes then, how do you win? You win by twofold, by obviously providing better argumentation. But what does better argumentation mean? And I'll again, this is more towards the next lecture in terms of intro to argumentation. But two things. Number one is you be more persuasive than the other things, than the other team. Persuasive means that your argumentation is stronger than the other teams. You can do this by multiple methods. You can show that your argument has better logic than the other team, or your argument is something that's much more important than the other team. There are lots of ways you can do this. I'm not going to go into them right now, but the thing is, you be persuasive by presenting better arguments than the other team. Number one. Number two, you are within the rules set by the debate. Parliamentary debate is very different from your TV debates where everyone is screaming at each other, because they're incredibly structured, but B, they also have a rule set which you have to follow, which means, for example, I'll come more to this later, how, for example, a third speaker cannot give new constructives, but can only give rebuttal. So for example, the third speaker has to go ahead and follow those rules for the speeches to be deemed good. And only it's when the speeches are deemed good are you going to win the debate. Therefore, any winning team must, number one, have persuasive argumentation, and number two, stay within the rules that go ahead and are present within the parliamentary debate format. Obviously, these rules differ depending on what kind of parliamentary debate this is. I've talked about Asian Parliamentary, I've talked about British Parliamentary, both have their own rules, and that's fine, you don't have to worry about right now. Violating rules is not particularly a bad thing. It's not like you're going to instantly lose the second you violate a rule. It's just going to make your arguments less better. And if your arguments are less better, they're obviously more likely to lose on a comparative. So therefore, it's good that you stay within rules. So again, any questions till now? Wonderful, assuming none. What is the format of Asian parliamentary debate then is the next question we need to ask ourselves. First thing you need to know is that there are 3 speakers per team, which is to say that you are never alone in a debate. You are within a team of 3 people. So there will be one team arguing for the motion and one team arguing against the motion. These teams are often known as government and opposition. So there will be one team government and one team opposition. Each team then comprises of 3 people who all will get to speak within the debate. How a debate starts is you will get a motion. So you will be given a particular motion. So for example, this house would ban social media from deplatforming politicians. That is a motion. You will be given the motion. After which, one second. No, this is not like the Oxbridge form of debating. Oxbridge form is very, very different. And it's usually like one person giving a speech. So, okay, no, wait, let's refresh that. Oxbridge form is very different, especially in terms of judging, because there you have, there's no constructive way of actually judging in Oxbridge formats. It's just how much the audience likes you, which is an interesting form of debate, but it's not really the most structured way of debate in terms of you having proper logic in terms of how you are assessed and proper explanations for how you win and lose a debate. So even though Oxbridge is a cool way, this is a more competitive way. So don't just like, obviously debating is about the higher idea of exchange of ideas and all of that beautiful stuff. But the competitive debating and how debating works at university level is more like you're trying to win or lose a particular debate. You're trying to beat the other team. Therefore, you need to have very qualitative ideas in terms of how you can beat another team. Oxbridge doesn't allow that because it's just does the audience like you or not? And therefore, it's not a very good way of winning or losing because it depends on too many external factors that don't like include your skills at all points of time. So therefore, it's not like Oxbridge. But yeah, coming back, there is one team from government and one team from opposition. At the beginning, when you're given a motion, you have 25 minutes of preparation. So I'll write it down, 25 minutes of preparation. 25 minutes of preparation means, number one, you do not have access to internet. You're not allowed to go to the internet to search for things. You can have printed documents or offline documentation, which means you can go ahead and if you have like already prepared in advance for a particular topic you thought might come, you can go ahead and read over your notes and all that stuff. But in general, you cannot surf the internet to go ahead and get all of your ideas. However, you're given 25 minutes to go ahead and think of ideas, right? So I think 25 minutes is a lot of time. So you can go ahead and think of multiple reasons as to why you should support a topic or you should be against a topic. And then you can elaborate on each of those reasonings within your team as to why you think this what particular reason is good and what supporting logic can we provide with this reason that allows us to express it in the best possible manner. So therefore, you'll have 25 minutes of preparation to do all of this, after which the debate actually starts. The first thing is then the first speaker of team proposition speaks. So how speeches are structured is your speeches are going to be 7 minutes long. You can obviously go lower than 7 minutes, but the maximum you can go is 7 minutes and 20 seconds. If you say anything after 7 minutes and 20 seconds, your judges will just discount whatever you said. So you're not actually allowed to go ahead and speak more than that, or because judges will act like you never spoke. So you'll just get ignored. You get 7 minutes and 20 seconds to speak at a maximum. At a minimum, you can speak for 30 seconds, you can speak for 5 seconds. Nobody's going to stop you. The only thing is, if you do not use all of 7 minutes, that means like if you use like you can win a debate speech by only speaking for 4 minutes. That's absolutely fine, but it's better to use the 7 minutes than 4 minutes. Like you have more time, you can use that time to explain more ideas. So therefore, it's obviously very useful to use the maximum amount of time you're given, because it allow you to like explain the maximum number of ideas in the best manner possible. So you can use lesser. It's just not a very strategically good idea to use lesser. But if you are scared that, hey, I cannot speak for 7 minutes, that's absolutely fine. You can start by speaking for 3 minutes, then you can slowly improve towards 4 minutes, then 5, then 6, then 7. Don't be afraid. Or one example like I really like to give is from my own experience. So when I started debating and I started in 8th grade, so like I have been doing this for way too long, don't ask questions. But my point is, it took me over a year to go ahead and stop my legs from shaking, which means every time I stood up to give a speech, my legs used to shake so hard I used to barely be able to stand. And that fear took over 1.5 years. And now I'd like to say I'm like relatively like I have relatively accomplished things within debate and like the world of debate, but that took time. And it's not like I started out perfect, right? Which is also my advice to all of you. Do not worry if you are not perfect at the beginning. Nobody is. It's more about putting work into things you find you're passionate about and then building on top of that. So therefore, even if you think that 7 minutes is too scary for you right now, that's absolutely fine. Start with 3. Nobody goes ahead and gives a perfect speech the first time they speak. This comes over lots and lots of practice, right? So don't worry about not being able to do better than others right at the moment you start. This applies for you as general first years in terms of your academics, because I know a lot of you are just scared like, hey, they know more programming than me, are they better? No, they're not. You just haven't been able to put the effort in. Start doing it now and you'll be perfectly fine little time down the road. So this applies to you as first year students in debating, but also in your cats. So coming back from that random lecture, the first speaker of proposition then goes ahead and speaks for 7 minutes. Their job is to go ahead and again just speak for 7 minutes as to why you should particularly support this topic and why it's a good idea. So let's do that. Then after that comes the first speaker of opposition. The first speaker of opposition then goes ahead and speaks for 7 minutes again and tells you why this is particularly a bad idea, or why number one, implementing this motion is a bad idea. This is constructive, where you go ahead and tell why you should not support this particular motion and why it's bad for you. Like, not for you means for people, number one. But number two, the first speaker of opposition also provides rebuttal. If you just like go back to 15 minutes before, I talked about rebuttal in terms of you going ahead and proving why the other team's argumentation is bad. So in this case, the first speaker of opposition will go ahead and talk to you about why the first speaker of proposition's argumentation was bad, or what was flawed within that argumentation, or why it might be untrue. So that is called rebuttal. So a first speaker of opposition will obviously provide their own constructors, but they will also provide some rebuttal to the first speaker of proposition. And that's what they will do within the 7 minutes. I'm also going to use some words over here. The first speaker of proposition is also known as the prime minister of the debate. So yeah, and the first speaker of opposition is known as the leader of opposition. After the first speaker of opposition is the second speaker of proposition. Again, a 7-minute speech. The second speaker then has a few things to do. Number one, they continue upon the constructive case, which means suppose in preparation time, you came up with 25, you had 25 minutes, right? And you came up with 4 broad ideas or 4 broad argumentation. Obviously, a first speaker cannot cover all of them. It takes time to explain an argument to its fullest extent. So, okay, yeah, it takes a lot of time to explain an argument to its fullest extent, right? Which means it might take you 2-3 minutes to go ahead and explain argumentation, which means during 7 minutes, this first speaker probably could not explain all arguments. So it is job of the second speaker to explain the remaining arguments. So that's one thing the second speaker does. Number two is rebuilding the case. Rebuilding the case looks like, for example, if opposition tried to rebut is the verb for rebuttal, try to rebut your case and prove why it's wrong, you can go ahead and then rebut that rebuttal by showing that their argumentation against whatever you said was actually untrue and what your first speaker said was actually right. Or if your first speaker made a mistake, you can try to provide some corrective mechanism, or you can provide some extra argument that fills the hole that your first speaker missed within the debate. So for example, if your first speaker provided 2 ideas, but one of them had a massive logical hole in them, you can go ahead and fix that gap as a second speaker. So even though that one speaker might have done a little poorly, you as a team still remain strong because the arguments are still strong because they don't have holes anymore. Therefore, the second speaker rebuilds argumentation by providing any remainder logic remaining or rebutting any attacks that came from the other side. Other than that, the third thing a second speaker does is then rebut the case coming from opposition, because opposition also provided some constructives. You have to go ahead and provide rebuttal to those constructives as well, which means you have to provide their individual constructive case is also the something that's particularly wrong with this within this debate. So 3 things a second speaker does, and I'll come more to this when I talk about speaker roles because this is important. Therefore, number 1, rebuilding the case. Number 2, providing additional constructives. Number 3, in terms of rebutting the case coming from the other team. So therefore, 7 minutes. The second speaker of proposition is also known as deputy prime minister. So these are fancy words debaters like to use because we think we're very special and we need to use jargon for everything. If you don't know what jargon is, jargon means fancy words. So jargon is kind of also jargon. So they're just extra fancy words that don't have meaning over what you normally say. So don't worry if you don't understand too many of these words. You can just ask me in the chat. But these are like we use deputy prime minister instead of saying second speaker proposition because that feels really boring. After second speaker proposition comes second speaker opposition. I think not very surprising. Again, a 7-minute speech. Everything I've already talked about in terms of rebuilding your case, providing your argumentation, and providing rebuttal. The speaker is known as the deputy leader of opposition. Cool. After that comes the third speaker prop. 7-minute speech. 7-minute speech. What is the third speaker supposed to do? A third speaker is slightly different. In Asian parliamentary format, a third speaker is not really allowed to give new argumentation, which means you cannot give brand new constructors that are individually unique from whatever your first two speakers have given. You can give some constructive in terms of you rebuilding the logic of your team, in terms of you responding to, like, if your team has already gone ahead and explained a topic, but you feel it needs a little bit more explanation, you can do that. If you think that the other team attacked this and you need to defend it by providing some like closing those logical holes within your arguments, you can do that. But you cannot go ahead and bring a brand new argument that your team never talked about as a third speaker, because it's unfair for the other side, because they don't get a lot of time to respond to that argument because it's coming so late. Especially the last speaker, when they speak, nobody talks after them, which means you can't go ahead and then rebut what they said. Therefore, it's important they don't bring in brand new constructive argumentation. They only reply to whatever has been said in the debate. Therefore, as a third speaker, you're not allowed to bring in brand new, unique constructors. You can talk about existing constructors, number one. But number two, most of your job is to provide rebuttal. Because the first and second speaker are focusing so much on constructors, are going to focus so much on building your case. It is your job as a third speaker to go ahead and take down the majority of the case that comes from opposition. That doesn't mean first two speakers don't engage with it. First proposition can't engage because obviously they can't like predict what the other team is going to say. We're going to talk about this later. This is something called preemption. This comes way later down the line. Don't worry about it right now. But to some extent, they can't say because the other team hasn't said anything. So they can't actually rebut against. So it's the second speaker is going to do some rebuttal for you, but the third speaker's main job is to go ahead and then do rebuttal. So that's what a third speaker does. The third speaker for team proposition is known as the government whip. After which we have a speaker opposition, again a 7-minute speech, and this person is known as the opposition whip. The opposition whip is the third speaker for the opposition side, and does all of the things I already talked about in terms of not being able to provide unique constructors, in terms of only going ahead and rebuilding their case of the team and the arguments that have already been presented, and in terms of going ahead and rebutting or providing rebuttal to whatever the other team has said, and the major job revolves around rebuttal. So I think till now the format has been pretty obvious / simple in terms of you can see a zigzag where it goes first speaker proposition, first speaker government, first speaker opposition, second speaker government, second speaker opposition, third speaker government, third speaker opposition. So you can see this zigzag where it's government opposition, government opposition. Now the format slightly changes a bit. After the third speaker opposition, we have the opposition reply. Cool. Or what does the opposition reply do? The opposition reply is the first speaker or second speaker from team opposition coming again, and they're going to give a 4-minute speech giving a biased summary of everything that has happened within a debate. A reply speaker then does not give any constructors. They cannot give any brand new material. They cannot also give any rebuttal, which means they can't even say that, hey, this team's logic is wrong. The only thing they can then do is provide a summary of the debate, but in such a manner that it feels like your team is winning. For example, you are going to say as opposition reply, hey, government team tried to bring up these 3 major points in the debate, but we've already shown you why all these 3 points are not possible. For example, our third speaker at opposition already rebutted this point by showing how point number 1 is not possible and how point number 2 is actually bad for everyone, which means that everything that a government side has been telling you till now is useless. But on a comparative, our team's points still stand strong because A, they have not replied properly to them, but B, we've shown you enough influence as to why these things are important and why these things are good for society. And therefore, our arguments are still pretty strong. This is an example of a reply speech where I'm not going ahead and bringing any new argument. I'm not going ahead and telling you why opposition was wrong. I'm just providing a summary in terms of what has already been said in the debate, but providing it in a manner that makes my team look like the winning team within this. This is a 4-minute speech, and this person is just simply known as opposition reply. After opposition reply, we have government reply, which is also 4 minutes. Again, the reply speaker is just the first speaker or the second speaker from the team going again, and they have to give a 4-minute summary of the debate. Are there any questions till now? Wonderful, assuming no questions. Again, you can just always unmute. Let's go into speaker roles and speaker roles now. Right? What is a speaker role? Wait, let me make this slightly fancier. Hey, I'm back. And it's supposed to be green. Yes. Speaker roles. What is a speaker supposed to do? Let's go for then let's go to first speaker. Right? A first speaker is supposed to do a few things. Number one, a first speaker is supposed to define the motion. What does define look like? So for example, let's go back to the deplatforming example I gave you within this debate, right? You need to go ahead and explain what deplatforming is. And you have to do it in a manner that's A, true, but B, also slightly helps your side. So you want to go ahead and explain, like, for example, wait, let's change this. Let's look at the third portion. This house prefers environmental movements, heavily prioritizing a local agenda over a global one. So as government, you are going to talk about, we want environmental movements that go ahead and focus local agendas, which means local campaigns in terms of go ahead and clean your rivers, go ahead and maintain a nice place to live in, or like individually stop like producing so much carbon emissions, those kind of things is a local agenda. A global agenda, alternatively, is you focusing on a worldwide this thing. So for example, countries should go ahead and not put all of dump so much poisonous stuff into the ocean, or like they should not have so many landfills which are going ahead and wasting land. Or for example, big corporates and factories should have a carbon tax in terms of them having to pay, like them having a limit in terms of how much CO2 they can produce every year. These are global things where they're on a very large scale international basis. Whereas local agenda is more about like keeping your surroundings clean. Don't go ahead and dump things in the river, or like make sure that you turn off the fan or when you're not in the room. These are like local local agendas for an environmental movement. The debate then is which one should be more prioritized, right? So as government, you are prioritizing local agenda. However, it's not very clear what local agenda is just by looking at the words local agenda. You have to go ahead and define what this looks like, what local agenda relates to. For example, the definition I gave is an example, right? Where local agenda looks like you telling individuals to go and behave in a particular manner so as to save the environment. And how this, and I gave examples of turning off the fan before you leave any or before you leave any room, or telling people to keep their surroundings clean. These are examples of a local agenda, and you give a definition of how a local agenda is implemented. So that's what a first speaker does. They define the motion by telling what exactly is going to happen, or what this local agenda is likely to look like in their paradigm. And then they explain why this local agenda is something that's better for the environment as opposed to a global agenda. We'll do more of argumentation in the next workshop, where we actually focus on why a particularly local agenda is better. But for now, I just want you to know a definition looks like you telling the judges what what a local agenda is and how exactly it's going to play in real life. So therefore, you define the motion. That's number one. What happens after you define the motion? The first speaker then is obviously supposed to provide constructives, where they go ahead and give the most important of the team's argumentation. As a first speaker, you have to focus on the important argumentation, because you obviously want all three speakers talking about it, because that's how you're able to make it the most convincing argument possible, and you're able to highlight the most important ones, which will potentially win you the debate. So you want to go ahead and talk about the most important constructives within your debate. If you're first speaker opposition, you are also expected to provide some rebuttal, if any, right? Or where you go ahead and take down the other team's case. This is what the first speaker does. Let's come to second speaker. Second speaker does three things. We've already talked about this. Number one, provide additional constructives in terms of you going ahead and bringing new arguments to teams. Brand new argumentation that the first speaker didn't have time for. Number two, rebuilding the case. Rebuilding looks like you going ahead and then like solving any logical gaps that existed within your first speaker speech, or talking about the attacks that already exist, or like the attacks that the other team did against your arguments, and talking about why those attacks were not very successful, or those attacks tried to argue the wrong thing, for example. Number three is obviously provide rebuttal. Then is the third speaker. The third speaker, again, to some extent, you might have to rebuild the case, although it's not a very strategically good idea to rebuild the case within your third speech, because it should have been done by a second speech. If you still have to wait by your third speech to go ahead and fill any logical gaps within your argumentation, that just means your argument is bad. But obviously, you can go ahead and do that, and it's allowed for you to do so. It's just that this should not have to wait so long to go ahead and be complete. So number one, you go ahead and rebuild the case, but most importantly, you provide rebuttal, where you take down the other team's argumentation and you talk about why it's particularly wrong, or what they were arguing is not particularly effective. We'll again talk about how exactly you take down argumentation within the next workshop. This is just so you know what is supposed to happen in terms of the overlying themes. But thirdly, and this is an advanced topic, where you provide weighing, right? What particularly is weighing? I'll give you a very short summary. Suppose government team is trying to talk about apples, has proved apples within the debate, and team opposition has proved oranges to the debate. You can't compare apples with oranges, right? It's really hard for me to go ahead, even if you have rebuttal to some extent, you're still going to go ahead and prove one thing which is good for one community. For example, if I talk about this, I'll give a more real life debate example. Government team and tries to argue how something will be particularly helpful for rich people and how this will affect them in a manner that benefits them. Team negative then comes ahead and argues why this will be better for poor people and how this will particularly affect them in a positive manner. You both have rebuttals, and you're both able to some extent take down the case that was given by the other side. But both have been able to show some benefits for the rich, and one team has been able to show some benefits for the poor. My question is, what should be more important to me as a judge within the debate? And that's what weighing is, where you explain why your particular side's benefits are more important than the benefits brought by the other side. So even if you are not able to disprove the benefits via rebuttal, you're able to show why they're unimportant in the debate and why your argumentation is more important and therefore debate winning. Therefore, what you do in weighing is show why you're more relevant. So for example, as opposition, I might try to argue that, listen, what this allows, if like in status quo, poor people already have it really bad, and any happiness that they derive from these benefits is going to be much larger than the happiness they get in the other, than rich people get from this. What do I mean? If I give a poor person 500 rupees, they are going to be incredibly happy. If I give a rich person 500 rupees, they're probably not going to care because they make more than that almost like in a minute or two. Therefore, that 500 rupees does not really matter and does not increase their happiness. Therefore, if we judge this debate by a metric of happiness, opposition side is better because they're able to provide more happiness to people, and therefore we are better because we make the world a better place by providing greater happiness. So you are able to argue at opposition that's more poor people and their benefits are more important because they're more likely to make people happy than it is that you make these rich people happier because these benefits are not really going to help them. Therefore, that is a particular example of weighing. And that's a third speaker's job, because the first two speakers actually focus on making the argument, right? They can't focus a lot of time on why this argument is important. Although, again, it is their job to a certain extent. The third speaker focuses because they have a view of the entire case, because both teams have now spoken for 14 minutes each and have presented all of their argumentation. A third speaker, then it's easy for you to go ahead and look at both cases and try to prove then why your case or your arguments are something that's much more important within this debate. Again, this is an advanced topic. Do not worry if you don't understand it or you don't think you can implement it just yet. I just want to give you a taste of what a slightly more advanced debating argument looks like, so you are able to understand what's in the future, just not what you have to learn right now. So that is the job of a third speaker. And these are, and finally we get to reply speaker. I've already told you what reply speaker does. It's very simple, a bias summary, where no brand new constructives, no brand new rebuttals. You just summarize the existing debate in a manner that's able to help your team and able to influence the judge by showing you, by revising whatever you've done good in this debate and why that is significant enough to place you over the other team, and therefore why you should win this particular debate. So that's what a reply speaker does. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's then come to burdens and types of motions. This is also a slightly advanced topic, but I do really want to cover this within the scope of this lecture. But before that, again, any questions? Anything to know? Wonderful. Moving on. Burdens and types of motion. So within, if I take you back to the motions tab, you will see multiple different motion types. Just give me a second. Yeah, you'll see multiple different motion types. What do I mean? For example, you see this house as South Korea would aim to do something. You see this house would ban something. You see this house prefers something. Or this house opposes. So these are different types of motion, which means it's not going to be one type of motion. You have to deal yourself with different types of motions. And what every different type of, just give me a second, or I will be right back, or any different place.
If you guys have any questions so far, feel free to ask.
Also, I'm back. But yeah, you can obviously ask questions. Okay, let's go back to this, right? So you see there are different types of motions that are particularly present, and these are obviously important to understand. So I won't go into a lot in terms of what these motions are and what exactly you have to do. I just want to familiarize with all of them. So number one, there is something called actor motions. Actor motions are motions in which you take the shoes of an actor and you have to explain what's best for them. So for example, this house as South Korea would aim to significantly increase its cross-border economic cooperation with North Korea. You don't have to focus on the economic aspect right now. The only thing is, this motion tells you that means you are South Korea within the scope of this debate, and you have to prove whether you want to increase your economic cooperation with North Korea, which means should you have more economic trade deals with North Korea? Should you focus on creating treaties which are going to help the both of you, or like reducing import tax and all of this kind of stuff? There's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to break it down right now, but the general idea is, as South Korea, what would you go ahead and do? Government in this case has to argue why this is particularly good for South Korea. Opposition has to argue why this is particularly bad for South Korea. Therefore, this debate is not about other individuals. If I'm able to prove that this is particularly good for someone in the US, that does not matter because the US is not part of this debate. This debate is about this house as South Korea, and therefore you have to focus individually on the benefits of South Korea at proving why it's good or bad for them. That's number one. Let's look at motion type number two. This house would ban something, or actually this house would. THW stands for this house would. In this house would, you assume the role of the government and you go ahead and then do a particular action. In this case, you would ban social media companies from doing something. That means that at government, the government would do something. This house would do something. Here, you're not limited to a particular actor, which means, like for example, in the first motion, like this house as South Korea, you always had to look for the benefits of South Korea. You don't have to do that anymore. You can argue for any actor in the world, and you can prove why it's particularly important to this particular individual later on. That's called weighing, as to why which individual is important and why we should care for them. But my point is, right now, all you need to focus on is you can go ahead and argue for any stakeholder in the world and argue why it's good or bad for them. So government will argue why it's good for the general public, which is like, for example, one body you could talk about and why this will help them. And opposition will try to argue why this is bad for general public and why this would particularly harm them. Therefore, that's what this house would motions are, where you as the government want to pass some policy or reject some policy, and you're trying to discuss how it's going to affect other people in the world. And that is what the THW motion is. There's a lot more nuance behind this and a lot more stuff like fiat, but again, that will come in future lectures in terms of advanced argumentation. So don't worry about it right now. Third, this house prefers motions. This house prefers, how I wanted to imagine this. Imagine there are two independent earths. Both of them are exactly identical except for this motion. What that means is that, for example, this house prefers environmental movements, heavily prioritizing local agenda over a global one, which means both of these earths are unique. However, on government's earth, environmental movements focus on local agendas and implementing these local agendas within communities. In opposition's earth, same environmental movement exists. However, they're going to focus on global agenda and implementing those things across the world. Then you go ahead and argue, what does this world look like? And is this a better world to live in for people? There again, number one, important to note is you can argue for the benefit or the harm of any stakeholder in the world or any actor in the world as to why it's good or bad for general public, why it's good or bad for poor people, etc., etc. However, in this case, both parties are identical except that one particular implementation that comes with the motion. And you have to argue that why one particular implementation and all of the things it leaks down into. So for example, local agenda, prioritizing local agenda might lead to some particularly unique benefits that don't exist on the other earth. And then you need to argue why those benefits are good or what those benefits are actually, like what are those benefits in the first place. So you go ahead and argue which particular version of earth is then better for you, like for individuals. So that is a this house prefers motion. Fourthly is this house opposes motion. This house opposes motion is slightly different in terms of you have to talk about why a particular government has to argue why a particular thing is bad, and it's most likely a thing that exists in status quo. So, for example, this house opposes the glorification of professional esports players. This means esports players, number one, exist in real world. That is obvious. Number two, they're glorified to a certain extent. What is this glorification? The motion doesn't tell you what the glorification is. Here is where I talk to you about the first speaker's ideas of definition and why they're important. Because first speaker proposition will go ahead and define what this glorification looks like, and the glorification and what that glorification leads to as to how people view these particular individuals and how they live their lives. Therefore, that definition becomes very important because it shapes the entire course of the debate in terms of what this glorification is in terms of people acting on it, and how this changes their lives. How, as number one, how people address these particular esport gamers, but number two, how these people's esport players' lives are changed because of it, or number three, how different outsiders view these esports players in terms of, like, for example, kids trying to become esports players. Or for example, glorification means you obviously put this person in a very high regard, even if they're not really meant to be in that high regard. That is what a esports player looks like. So, for example, I can define glorification of esports players looks like these people being thought of as really hardworking individuals who overcame all their odds, and like similarly to high sports athletes who went ahead and were able to work really hard and then become really successful, and therefore people treat them with respect. What this means is this glorification is particularly bad because it's not actually true. That success in video games is highly dependent on other factors like the quality of your keyboard or the quality of your mouse, and therefore it's not really upon the skill this individual brought upon, but upon the kind of hardware they possessed, and because maybe they were rich and they were able to buy better stuff for themselves, and therefore these were thought of great players. Or even if it's not glorification on their quality as a player, the glorification in terms of how this is a great career for you because you can do things like play games which you obviously enjoy, but also obviously make a lot of money doing this because these players earn so much money. So these people are glorified in terms of how amazing their profession is because you do what you're able to, like, you do what you love and you're able to make money. But in real life, you have to work so hard. For example, you have to practice like 14 hours a day in order to become like the top of the world. You also like develop a lot of diseases, for example, because again, you're sitting in one place, you're not really moving, you're stuck, or you're stuck to a particular place, you're putting too much pressure on your brain, or flashing lights, all of that stuff, which means it's also incredibly harmful for you. But glorification means you don't really focus on all of that. You're really just focusing on the particular idea of how esports is great. This means kids who want to become esports players now increase in number because glorification means they think, hey, I love gaming right now. And obviously, glorification means that you only see successful stories of people earning a lot of money, which means a lot of kids want to get into this as a future potential career. However, becoming a successful esport player is really hard because of the reasons I mentioned, in terms of you needing the best hardware, in terms of you having to be practicing for extremely long, in terms of you going ahead and then developing a lot of diseases, which are obviously bad for your health, which means it's not a good idea or a rational idea to become an esports player, but the glorification makes it seem like it's a very good idea to kids. And kids are going to actively harm their health and their potential future by going ahead and trying to become esports players. This is an argumentation in support of why we should oppose something. And this is what an opposed motion tries to ask you. So circling back to all of that, this house opposes is particularly talking about why something that probably exists in status quo is a bad idea. So I did a few things here. Number one, as a first speaker of proposition, for example, I defined what this glorification looks like, which obviously shaped the entire debate in terms of how this might affect children. Therefore, definitions are important and must be done at first speaker. But number two, after definition, I give supporting rationale as to why this glorification is harmful and something that should not be done, and therefore why we need to oppose it in the first place. Therefore, it is the burden of government over here to prove why it's a good, why something is particularly bad and must be opposed in status quo. and opposition tries to argue why no, it's still a particularly good thing, and therefore we should not really oppose it because it provides a lot of help to individuals. Okay, so the question in the chat is, what if this opposition has a different idea of glorification? This is something called a definitional challenge, and something we'll cover in future videos and future workshops, where because this becomes slightly bit more complex, I try to answer this question in brief. If opposition has a different definition, then both teams also have to argue on what is the correct definition and then provide their points. This leads to very messy debates, because if you can't agree on definition in the first place, then it's very hard you agree on the points, because the points are going to be very different because you're operating under very different definitions. Therefore, it's important to, number one, clear up the definition in the first place. The definition is then dependent on which one is more reasonable and which one is more fairer. So usually government is the first team to provide a definition. And if that definition is fair, if both teams can argue within the scope of the definition, then it has to be accepted. Opposition can stand up and say, no, that definition is unfair and it doesn't allow us to debate properly for XYZ reasons. This is known as a definitional challenge. The point at which you challenge a definition, you have to provide reasons as to why you're challenging this definition, why it's bad, and then you provide a new definition. However, it's upon the judge to then by the idea of whether this definitional challenge is legit or not, because there are going to be some cases where government definition is so absurd that you absolutely cannot argue within it, and then a definitional challenge is deemed acceptable, and therefore opposition definition is used within the debate, or is the one that the judge uses as a metric to judge the debate. But if it's reasonable enough, if opposition's challenge is something that doesn't really make sense, or government's definition is thought enough to be accurate enough to go ahead and then represent what the debate is supposed to be about, then government's definition is taken to be the correct one. So yeah, this is an extremely messy and complicated topic I can't cover right now, but you are allowed to propose a different definition, and then it depends on which one the judge finds to be the more accurate definition, which allows for a better debate in general. And that's how different definitions work. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. So again, this house, circling back, this house opposes. Government tries to argue about why a particular thing is harmful to status quo and we should oppose it. And opposition tries to argue why it's beneficial and we should not oppose it. So then there are two more. Number one, this house believes that. So here, this house believes that is kind of similar to this house would, where, for example, this house believes it is the interest of the Catholic Church to officially recognize folk saints. Folk saints definition is given over here, but these are people who, these are basically dead people who were not recognized by the church as saints, but were considered as saints by the general public. Therefore, the Catholic institution did not deem them as saints, but other people recognize them as saints for the great work they did. And therefore, should these people, the debate becomes, is it in the interest of the Catholic Church to go ahead and officially recognize these people as saints, or should they just go ahead and ignore these people and say, hey, they're still not saints for us, even if you want to believe that? Again, very complicated, very messy topic. You don't have to, even if it doesn't make sense to you now, absolutely no problem. The question is, what is THPT? THPT is this house believes that. In this kind of in a THPT motion is mostly a harms versus benefit. So for example, this debate is this house believes that it is in the interest of the Catholic Church to do something. You have to then argue why this is particularly you have to argue why this is particularly true, and why officially recognizing folk saints is something that the Catholic Church will benefit from, and why and as opposed to opposition that will argue that it is not in the interest and therefore it's harmful for Catholic Church to go ahead and recognize folk saints. The simplest way I can do this for you right now is to think of THPT as a harms versus benefits debate, where it's this house believes that XYZ, and is or wait, this is very tricky because these are harder THPT motions, but this house believes that, and you are giving a particular statement. You have to prove the harms versus the benefits of that particular statement. Proposition obviously has to show why the benefits are better, and opposition has to show why the harms are better. So in this one, this house believes that, and there is a particular statement. The statement is, it is in the interest of the Catholic Church to officially recognize folk saints. At this point, government is going to argue that if the Catholic Church officially recognize these folk saints, it is in their interest. So the benefit, in terms of the benefit that you're able to gain from this, is much more important for the Catholic Church as opposed to whatever harms that are necessarily going to materialize out of this. So therefore, the benefits are much more important than the harms if this statement was true. Opposition, on the other hand, is going to argue if this statement was true and the Catholic Church officially did recognize the folk saints, the harm that is created is incredibly high for the Catholic Church, and therefore it is a bad thing. I'm focusing on Catholic Church right now because of the words in the interest of, and therefore this debate largely centers around Catholic Church because it's talking about the interests of the Catholic Church. But this is not always going to be the case for THPT. You're going to get different motions about this house believes that, in which you might just get a claim. So, for example, this house believes that it is more important to spend time with your family than it is to spend time at work. Very basic example. Therefore, you have this house believes that, and you have a particular like statement where it is better to spend time with your family than it is to spend time at work. Then you have to argue, if this was true and you spent more at proposition, if this was true, why this will be more beneficial for a person and why the benefits are something more important than the harms. Opposition tries to argue, if it is true that you spend more time with family than you do spend time at work, then why this is particularly harmful for individuals and why it will cause them to maybe lose their jobs or particular things, and why these harms are much more important than the benefits you can do. Yeah, thanks for the example, Abhijit, but I think we're good now. So yeah, this is what THPT does in terms of you have a particular sentence. If the sentence was true, you have to analyze whether the harms versus the benefits of that particular sentence are something that are good within this debate. And that's how you analyze THPT motions. Circling back, this is burdens or these other types of motions. Burdens then are what you're supposed to prove in a debate. So motions dictate some level of burden. So for example, if I had this house opposes this house opposes glorification of professional esports players, proposition has a burden to prove why we should oppose something. Why is it so harmful that we have to go ahead and oppose this? This is a burden on team proposition because this is something they have to prove in this debate in order for them to be convincing. Burdens in a debate are equal and opposite. What this means is that if there is a burden on proposition to prove something, then there is a burden on opposition to prove the exact opposite. Therefore, opposition has to argue why we should not oppose this particular thing and why it's particularly, it's not harmful. Either A, it's beneficial and therefore there's no point opposing, or B, the harms are not such a large extent that opposing it is a good thing in the first place. So therefore, what we're doing in this debate is government has a burden set by the motion that you should oppose something, and therefore they need to prove why opposing something is important. And opposition has a burden in this debate, or they have to prove to me as a judge that you have to not oppose something. So burdens are of two types: intrinsic, extrinsic. Intrinsic is what the motion tells you to do. So the motion will ask you to prove some things. Extrinsic is teams will take additional things, like teams will say, hey, we have 3 arguments and we are going to prove X, Y, Z. So then you have a burden to go ahead and prove X to its fullest extent. Otherwise, I can't correct it. If you say I'm going to prove X, you have to prove X to me to be convincing. And therefore, you have a burden to go ahead and prove the entirety of the argument X. If you don't do that, you can't say that X is beneficial if you never proved X happens in the first place. Therefore, you have a burden to prove something to me before you're able to tell me if it's good or not. And that surrounding logic, the need to provide that logic is known as burden. I hope that makes sense. Are there any questions right now? Cool. Assuming none, again, we'll cover burdens in much more detail in future workshops, especially surrounding argumentation. Don't need to worry about them right now. Just as a quick refresher, burden is something you're supposed to prove in a debate before you go ahead and prove if it is a good thing or a bad thing. Because if you don't prove it exists, it's pointless for you to go ahead and argue whether it's good or bad. You need to prove it exists, like it's happening right now, and only then you can argue why it's beneficial or bad. So that is burdens and types of motions. So you will deal with all of these motions within Asian parliamentary format. Uh, last two things, and we'll get done with this quickly. If you're sleepy, points of information. During your speeches, and when you have 7-minute speeches, your first and last minute are protected, which means nobody can ask you uh, points of information. Let's type it down, right? Nobody can ask you points of information. During the rest of your speech, which means between your first minute and your 6th minute, people can ask you points of information. What are points of information? Points of information are questions which are 15 to 20 seconds long, which the opposing team can ask to you within your speech. So therefore, like they can stand up and ask point of information, which happened in offline debates. In online, this looks like you unmuting and saying point of information, or you typing it in the chat, depending on what the speaker prefers. So you, like, for example, someone will ask you point of information. You can either accept or reject that point of information. If you accept it, the other speaker has, the person who asked you has 15 to 20 seconds, or you actually not 20, but like 10 to 15 seconds to ask you a question, and then you have to answer that particular question. And that's basically what points of information are. You can obviously reject every single point of information and not take any. It's considered number one bad practice, but number two, it's also bad for your argumentation, because if you take points of information, you're able to argue better along their case, because they will ask you some questions or they will try to attack your argument, and you're able to show why their attacks are bad, number one. But number two, you're able to link your cases together by exactly showing, like, to the other, like you're able to show that whatever the other team is trying to prove within this debate is particularly harmful, and you're able to do it right in between your speech, because the speakers are actually speaking between your speeches. Therefore, it is incredibly helpful to take the points of information within your speech, because it helps you engage better, and you're able to actually take down the other team's claims during the middle of your speech. So therefore, it's useful. How many should you take? Normally, during a 7-minute speech, you're advised to take 1 to 2 POIs. More than that is bad, obviously, because you want to focus on your own material, and obviously you have stuff written down that you want to express within a debate. And just taking points of information is bad, because you don't get time to actually give your own arguments, because you're replying to those questions. So taking more than 2 is extremely bad. Taking none at all is also a bad idea, because number one, it shows the judge that is scared of the other team. But number two, because you're not able to actually respond to them. If you just focus on giving your own argumentation and do not actually respond to the other team, you cannot take down the other team. It's only when you take points of information, it's only when you engage with the other side are you able to show why their argumentation is bad. Therefore, it's extremely important to take points of information, because it provides clarity to the judge as to how strong your case is. Because even if your case is strong in a vacuum, it needs to be strong compared to the other side. And it's only when you take points of information can a judge accurately assess how good these are when they put up against each other. And therefore, it's very important for you to go ahead and take points of information. So therefore, it's recommended you take 1 within your speech, maybe 2 if you have the time, but definitely not more than 2. Also, never take, like, this is a general debater tactic, never take 2 POIs back to back, because that is just bad. So even if you do plan to take 2 POIs, keep them spaced out. Take 1 within the 4th minute and 1 within like 5 minutes, 30 seconds. So you have plenty of time between the 2 POIs to make argumentation. I won't go into why this tactic is good or bad right now, because it might fly a bit over your head. So, but therefore, other team can obviously ask points of information during your speech. You can also obviously ask points of information to the other team. Few things to note: do not badger, which means don't keep spamming POI, POI, POI. If they reject you, wait for 15, 20 seconds, or like actually wait for 30 seconds to 1 minute to ask for point of information again. Number two, like again, keep them short. Keep them 15, 20 seconds, 15, 10, 15 seconds long. Don't take up the entirety of the time, because that's not a good idea. But number three, keep it a question so it's easily answerable by the other team. Because if you just make a random statement, the other side will go like, okay, and continue, right? It doesn't really make sense. However, if you ask a question, they're forced to answer that question. And therefore, it's always a good idea to keep your POI as a question. That's something you're supposed to do. Again, you can, POIs only happen between the first and the 6th minute, which means the first, like from the time your speech starts to the 1 minute mark, and from the 6th minute mark to the 7th minute mark, nobody can ask you POIs. Between that, anyone can offer you a POI, which you may choose to accept or reject. Also note, reply speeches have no POI. So reply speech is only 4 minutes long. All 4 minutes are protected. There are no points of information during the reply speeches. Again, any questions? Wonderful, no questions. I hope I'm doing really well. Final thing, and this is just to understand the idea of Asian Parliamentary better, is something called topic selection. So how topic selection works is when a debate round starts, you are given 3 motions. So you will be given motion 1, motion 2, motion 3. For here, for example, use only 1 motion. That's because in British parliamentary format, you are given only 1 motion and you have to debate that. That's not how it works in Asian parliamentary. So for example, here you are given 3 motions and you have to rank those motions. Okay, so you have to say my first preference is motion number 1. My second preference is motion number 2, and my third preference is motion number 3. That's one particular order you can give. You can obviously choose whatever you order you want. How is it then decided what motion you're actually going to debate? First thing that happens is that both people who have the third motion, like third preference, or that motion is eliminated. So if motion 3 was your third preference, that motion is eliminated. You'll never actually debate that motion. Same with the other team. So now, if you both have different third preferences, then 2 motions have been eliminated. Only 1 motion is remaining, and that will be the motion debated. Cool. If both have different third preferences, then remaining motion is debated. Let's type this out. What happens if you both have the same third preference? Okay, now 2 things can happen. Number 1, you both have the exact same order, where you have first same, second same, and third same, right? If you have the same orders, then the first preference is debated because both of you want to debate the same motion. Then first pref is debated. If now you have the same third preference, however, your first and second is switched, which means you both don't want to do the same motion. However, your first preference is different from their first preference, then a coin toss takes place. If first and second pref is different, then coin toss, and the winner of the coin toss, that motion is debated. Sounds pretty simple, right? So that's the algorithm for deciding how motion works. So we'll be provided with 3 motions. You both will have to rank them individually separately. So your team ranks your own by after discussing with each other. You have 5 minutes for this. So you will talk about on the 3 motions, whichever you feel most comfortable with, which you feel you're most likely to win. Other team does the same, and then you present your rankings to each other. If you both have different third preferences, then there's only 1 motion left, and that's the one you're going to debate. If you both have the same third preference, and you both have the same first and second preference as well, then the motion, which was your first preference, is debated. If you both have the same third preference, but you both have different in first and second, then you do a coin toss, and the winner's first preference is then debated. So you have 5 minutes to decide what motion, to order your motions, to decide your preferences. Then coin toss or whatever happens. Then you finalize a motion. Then you have those 25 minutes of preparation that I initially talked about, where you go ahead and then prepare for 25 minutes and try to think of arguments. That is the end of the session. I hope that made sense in terms of everything I've talked about. Just a very quick summary. Number 1, what is parliamentary debate and how exactly it happens in terms of the rules surrounding it, in terms of you trying to make more persuasive arguments than the other team. The format of the Asian parliamentary debate, in terms of how there are 3 speakers for each side, and then there's a reply speaker. This reply speaker, and how speaker, all non-reply speakers are 7 minutes, and reply speeches are 4 minutes. Speaker roles in terms of what a speaker is supposed to do, what a second speaker is supposed to do, what third speaker does, and what a reply speaker does. In terms of types of motions that I talked to you about, and what are the burdens associated with them, or what exactly you have to prove. Finally, number one, in terms of points of information and how they're asked/answered, and in terms of topic selections in a nation, if you ever go through a nation parliamentary debate, how you're supposed to choose what topic you're going to debate. That is pretty much it for this session. Are there any questions, anything you'd like to know furthermore? Wonderful. I assume no questions. Again, you can always reach out to me. My name is Rohan Grover. You can also reach out to our coordinators, Abhijit Singham and Raghav Dwivedi. Both of them are extremely helpful and have lots of experience as well. They'll definitely be able to help you out. That's pretty much it. And thank you all.
Thank you so much, Rohan, for the session. All right, then we'll be closing here. We'll be streaming the session again tomorrow, where I think Joel and Srijan will be present to answer any questions. And yeah, we'll see you guys then.